All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to class number 2 about the Beit Hamikdash, about the temple. So last week we did primarily the Temple Mount and the surrounding areas in Jerusalem. Today we are going to get more into the actual building of the temple itself. So I'm going to walk you through all of it, and it's pretty exciting stuff. If we could get this to work. All right, so here you can see on the screen in front of you. Rebecca, can you see over there? So this is a bird's eye view of what the Temple Mount would look like. We have the direction, so north is at the top, the side over here is the west, the side would be the east. And basically it was made up, let's call it 2 parts. This is kind of the courtyard. Well, all of this would be the courtyard, and then this square right over here is the actual indoor building. So this is the only part that's covered by a roof with indoor. Everything else that you're looking at is pretty much outdoors, with the exception of a couple of places here and there. Here you have another view. So what we're going to be imagining ourselves, we're imagining ourselves as if we've entered onto the Temple Mount from all the different many entrances that we spoke about last week. And once you're on Temple Mount, what are you going to be looking at? Here you have a different view of people that would be coming in through the Temple Mount. So this is them entering onto what we call Rabbi, the Temple Mount, and then they would be standing on the Temple Mount, and they would be in one of these places over here, depending on where they entered, and they would be looking at the actual building of the Beit Hamikdash. This is what it would look like today as you kind of came onto Temple Mount. I just want to skip this. All right, so let's talk about it. Imagine yourself, here you are, you've entered onto the Temple Mount, and there you are standing. You are now in an area which is called Rabbi. And as you would come closer to the actual Temple Mount, on the Temple Mount, when you would come closer to the Beit Hamikdash, there would be a fence. The fence is called a soreg. If you look carefully at this picture over here, you can see there's this fence right over here. So kind of in the middle of where people are, there's this fence. This fence was called, as I mentioned to you, the soreg. And the fence was to warn people if they were not permitted to enter further. So person that was, for different reasons, you might not have been allowed to enter even further. So this was a soreg. This was kind of a low fence, not a huge fence with barbed wire, but just a low fence that kind of had signs in it that would warn a person that they can't go any further. Beyond this fence, the space between that fence until you actually get inside the temple was called the chel. So as you could see in this picture over here, including these stairs that people would go up to. So even once you went onto Temple Mount, to Rabbi, you would still go up another level even to get into the actual compound of the Beit Hamikdash, of the temple. So that space in between the fence called the soreg and the actual temple itself was called the chel. Here we go. That's what's called the chel, that space between the fence and the actual temple itself. All right. So we've gone onto the Rabbi, onto the Temple Mount. We've walked past the fence, which was called the soreg. We've moved past that empty space called the chel, and now we are actually inside the actual Beit Hamikdash itself. So the first section that we're going to talk about was called the Ezras Noshim, the woman's courtyard. So here, what they do in these pictures for you is they're showing you the entire Beit Hamikdash, and then in the corner, you'll see in a square which part we are talking about. So we're talking about this section right over here. This is called Ezras Noshim, the woman's courtyard. There you can see it more clearly in the picture. It's being highlighted. That's the section called the Ezras Nashim. So what was happening inside the Ezras Nashim and what was it for is what we're going to take a look at. So first of all, before we talk about what were the different sections inside the Ezras Nashim used for, there were a number of very special events that took place in the Ezras Nashim on different occasions, and we will talk about two of them. The first one was an event called Hakel. Hakel is every 7 years, the year following the Shemitah, the sabbatical year. On Sukkot, the entire Jewish nation would gather in the Beit Hamikdash. It was an obligation, the Torah says, for men, women, and children. Hakel esa'am, gather the people. Ha'anoshim, the men, ba'anoshim ba'ataf, and the men, women, and children. Every Jew had an obligation to be there. And the king would read from the Torah in the middle of the Beit Hamikdash for everyone. There were special sections of the Torah that they would read. And it was definitely a tremendous experience that everyone would remember. So every 8th year, every year following every year following Shemitah on the Sukkot, it would be a huge thing. Obviously, that affected the whole Sukkot because thousands of people were coming and the Beit Hamikdash had to be prepared. But as you could see in this picture, they built a platform in the middle, and there's the king. The king would read from the Torah, and you can see Jews everywhere. They all came to hear the king read from the Torah. That's one of the famous events that took place in this part of the Beit Hamikdash called the Ezras Nashim. The other famous event took place every year on Sukkot, and it was called Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And that is that every day in the temple, they would pour wine on the altar. However, on Sukkot, they would pour water as well down the altar. And it was a grand celebration in going to draw that water at night, which would then be poured on the altar in the morning as well. And the Mishnah and the Talmud at great length describe to us what a joyous celebration it was, where everyone would gather in this part, the Ezras Nashim, and the sages and the righteous people would dance, and they would juggle fire, and they would build a balcony where the woman would go on top and the men would be downstairs. And it was really this tremendous, every night of Sukkot, dancing and music, a whole night celebration in the Beit Hamikdash, something really very special. They would build these giant lanterns, and the Mishnah describes that they provided so much light that it lit up the entire Jerusalem. That's how it was. So this is another, here you go, that's these giant lanterns that I was telling you about. They play music and dance. Also a special event that took place in this section of the Beit Hamikdash. Here you can see what I was telling you about before. They would build a platform where the woman would be upstairs and the men would be downstairs. These are the stairs where the Levites would play instruments, which I'll tell you a little bit about more in a couple minutes. So that's just kind of some of the highlights that took place in this part of the temple called the Ezras Nashim. And let's get a little bit more into it. So in these actual Ezras Nashim, in this section of the Beit Hamikdash, there was, in each of the four corners, there was kind of like a little room, if you will. There was a little chamber, that would be a better word for it. And we're going to go to these four chambers and see what was in each of the chambers. So we're going to start off with the chamber on the northeast. So just to give you an idea, if you look in the bottom right corner, here's the west, here's the east. So this is the north. So we're the northeast, we're starting with the northeastern corner. The northeastern corner, there was a chamber, and the chamber was called Lishkas Ha'etzim, which means the chamber of wood. By the way, the picture that you're seeing now on the screen was built to scale. So if you want to understand kind of what a human being would have looked like inside, this chamber, that's kind of what it would have looked like. So in the Beit Hamikdash, they needed a lot of wood. Why did they need a lot of wood? Because there was constantly wood, a lot of wood burning on the altar for all of the sacrifices that were being brought. So there was a tremendous amount of wood being used constantly in the temple, and not just any wood could go on the altar. The wood had to be checked first to make sure that it wasn't wormy, that it was appropriate. Of course, only the best for Hashem. So all the wood would be kept there, and some senior Kohanim, their job would be to check the wood. And so this is where they collected wood and checked wood and prepared wood. This was called the Lishkas Ha'itzim. All right, moving on to the southeast corner, the southeastern chamber. This was called the Lishkas HaNazirim, the chamber for the Nazarites. So we know that the Torah talks about this concept of a Nazir, a person that takes an oath that they will not drink wine, come in contact with a dead person, etc. And when their Nazir stage is over, they would have to come to the temple and do a whole ceremony to complete their Nazir time. So that's what you're looking at over here. You're looking at a Nazir who's they're cutting his hair and they're preparing the different parts of the sacrifice for him. So this was called the Lishkas HaNazirim, where a Nazarite would come to complete his Nazir sentence. Moving on to the third chamber. So now we're at the northwest chamber. The northwest chamber is called the Lishka of the a Metzora, Lishkat HaMetzoraim, the lepers chamber. And we know that the Torah also talks about something called Tzara'at. Tzara'at is not exactly leprosy, but Tzara'at is more of a miraculous disease that a person would get for certain sins that they would do. And they would have to stay away from people and do repentance. And at the end, they would come for their final stages of purification and elevation as well. So this is where they would come to complete their particular service that they needed to do. Now, interestingly, is that in this particular chamber, there was a mikveh. There was a ritual bath, which is where the Metzora would have to dip before he can complete his process. So here you can see inside the chamber, there is a mikveh where he would go as well, or perhaps if anyone else needed to use a mikveh, they could use this mikveh as well. All right, moving on. Hello, Leon.
Good morning. Boker Tov.
Boker Tov. So we're looking at the Beit Hamikdash, at the temple, a little bit closer. And in this first section of the Beit Hamikdash that we're describing, there was four. You see in these four corners, there are these four chambers. So we're taking a look at all of these four, and you're just in time for the fourth one. Here we have Dr. Stoltz joining us as well. So let me just quickly do a quick review. So basically, we've been talking about this first section of the temple called the Ezrat Nashim, the woman's courtyard, which we described many different special occasions what it was used for. It's kind of like a big open courtyard. And in each of the four corners, there was a chamber. And we started with this, the northeastern chamber, which we said was Lishkata Eitzim. That was used for the wood, because in the temple, they used a lot of wood, and the wood had to be prepared and checked. Then we had this chamber over here, which was used for a Nazir, a Nazarite who finished being a Nazir and would have to come to the temple and be shaved down, etc. This one over here was used for the Metzora, for a leper. It had a mikveh inside of it. And now we're up to this Lishka right over here, which is what we're going to discuss currently. So here we have the fourth chamber, which is on the southwestern corner, and this chamber was used for this one was called Lishkat Hashmanim, the chamber of oil. So in the temple, every time they brought a sacrifice, it was also brought with oil and flour and salt. There were a bunch of other ingredients that would have to go on the temple as well, onto the altar as well. And there were certain sacrifices that were only made up of flour and oil, etc. So in addition to the animals, there was a lot of oil being used. Of course, there was also oil being used for the menorah, for the candelabra, which they would light as well. So in this particular chamber, in this fourth chamber that we're talking about over here, is called Lishkat Hashmanim. This is where they kept all the oils. So if you can imagine during the Hanukkah story, when the Greeks came in and they defiled all the oil, this is pretty much where they were hanging out. But it wasn't there. This one wasn't only oil for the menorah. This also kept oil, like I said, because part of sacrifices many times was to bring oil together with flour and salt. So inside here, there were other things in addition to oil, but primarily oil. And so it was called the Lishkas Hashmanim. I want to point out that they deliberately put it right over here. If you look in the bottom right corner in this nice little diagram that they give us, this is the chamber which is closest to the altar. This funny shaped thing where it's a big square and then something protruding from it, that's the altar, this is a ramp, and that's the altar itself. So this chamber right here in the corner is the one closest to the altar, so that they would have closest access. And actually, where all three of these other chambers only had one entrance, this chamber over here had two entrances, one way you could enter through this courtyard and one way you could enter through this courtyard. So they would kind of have easy access and availability every time they needed to bring any supplies with them onto the altar. Sounds like a plan? Now, another interesting thing that took place in the Ezras Nashim, in this area that we're calling the courtyard of the woman, which doesn't mean it was only for women, but in this giant big area. So they had the four chambers, and then they also had, as you can see over here, it's kind of a little room, and it says over here in Hebrew, Sanhedrin Ketana, the lower Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin is the higher courts. Of course, there were courts in every single city called the Beth Din, and there was this hierarchy of courts. And then when you came to Jerusalem, people came to Jerusalem for inspiration, for direction, for instruction. So there was the Sanhedrin, the high court, and the high court was kind of made up of different parts. So there was a part of the high court was sitting on the Temple Mount, and part of the high court was actually sitting inside the Ezras Nashim, this part of the temple. And this is not even the highest part. Then there'll be even one more, even closer to the main part of the Beit Hamikdash as well. So they had a section over here that they can convene, and they can, figure out and discuss and rule on different matters, etc. It's just kind of an interesting thing that in the Beit Hamikdash itself, they had a court as well, and it kind of goes to show how important this court was and how important fulfilling the mitzvahs properly is, because a person comes to the Beit Hamikdash for inspiration, to be inspired, to be, see and feel Hashem. So it's appropriate that in that place we set up a Sanhedrin, a high court, which in addition to being used to figure out fights between people, was primarily used to be able to figure out what's the appropriate and correct way to fulfill a certain mitzvah. So if there ever came up a question, is the sacrifice good? Is it not good? What should we do over here? What should we do over there? Then the court was right there ready to give its ruling. Tell me if yours is dying. Is it still on?
I need to minimize the window because I can't see where the battery is.
It's okay. If it will give you something will pop up. If something pops up, tell me. All right. So we have the middle of this Ezras Nashim was kind of empty open space. You had these four corners, which are the four chambers which we just went through, and where this black square was, that was the small Sanhedrin, called small because the lower Sanhedrin, better word, because it wasn't the highest court, but it was a court nonetheless of the higher courts. Now, as you kind of walked closer, so if you're going west and you walk through this courtyard and now you were heading into the next part of the Beit Hamikdash, which was even a holier part of the Beit Hamikdash, you came to a section where there were 15 stairs. So these stairs that you're looking at over here, these are 15 steps. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, each step was approximately half of a cubit. So obviously the dimensions that the Beit Hamikdash is measured in is the ancient Torah measurements called amot, or in English cubits, so approximately 9 inches. So each step was approximately 9 inches high and 9 inches deep as well. So it's a pretty, it's a decently significant step, a little bit more than half a foot each step high and a little bit more than a half a foot each step going deep. These 15 steps correspond to 15 chapters of Tehillim that all begin with the words Shir HaMa'alot. So chapter 120 through chapter 135 in the book of Tehillim and the book of Psalms written by King David all begin with the word Shir HaMa'alot, which means a song of ascent, a song of going up. So it's kind of, the idea of steps. And the tradition is that King David composed and sung these 15 chapters of Tehillim while he dug the foundations for the temple. So these 15 steps are corresponding to those 15 chapters of Tehillim. The first two letters of Hashem's name, which are Yud and Hey, also have the numerical value of 15. And sometimes Hashem's name is also only spelt with the Yud and the Hey. So that's another thing that 15 is special. And on these 15 steps is where the Levites, the Leviim, would sing and play their instruments on Sukkot, what we spoke about before, during that ceremony where they would gather the water. And so that was one of the things that they would go up and do over there. When you came to the top of the stairs, so when you came to the top of the 15 stairs, here's another kind of look at the 15 stairs. When you came to the top of the stairs, there were these two giant copper gates. This was called Sha'ar Nicanor, the gates of Nicanor. And I will tell you in a minute a famous story that the Gemara tells about these gates of Nicanor. But before we do that, here you have a little bit of a different angle, but at the bottom of the stairs on each of the sides, there were these two kind of entrances. And what this took you is it took you to a chamber which was kind of underneath. So it was like a basement-like chamber. And this was called the Chamber of Musical Instruments. In Hebrew, Lishkat Klei Shir. And this is where the Levites would store their musical instruments and where they would go to rehearse for their performances. I guess in today we would call it backstage, So that's where the Levites would go, and they would have all of their musical instruments, and they would prepare, rehearse, keep their music notes, and so on and so forth, whatever they needed. That's on the right and the left. All right, here you have a little bit of a, perhaps what it looked like inside. There's different Levites with all of their different musical instruments, a harp, a lyre, whatever, trumpets, whatever was the instruments that they were playing in those days. So as you came to the top of the stairs, as I mentioned to you before, there were these two extremely large, very famous gates called Sha'ar Nicanor. This is the gates that separated between the first section of the Beit Hamikdash, called the Ezras Nashim, the women's section, and that's going to take you to the second section, which was called the Azora, the actual courtyard of the temple. And the reason why these were so famous is because there was this man, Nicanor, who provided these gates. And the Talmud tells a story that Nicanor wanted to do something for the temple. So he went to Alexandria in Egypt, and he found the finest and the best craftsmen that would work with copper. And he got them to make for him very large, beautiful, magnificent, exceptional, didn't spare any money. And they made this beautiful, beautiful gates for him. And Nicanor's plan was to take them back and have them installed in the Beit Hamikdash, in this gateway between the first and second section of the temple. However, when he was on the boat traveling from Alexandria to Israel, a great, great storm broke out, and the boat was being threatened to capsize, and everyone was freaking out. So they started to lighten the weight of the boat, and there was two very, very heavy things in this boat, which were these gates that Nicanor had prepared, thousands of pounds. So a bunch of the sailors picked up the first gate and they tossed it overboard. And Nicanor, of course, was distraught, and they were getting ready to pick up the second one and throw that overboard as well. And Nicanor jumped on the gate and he held on to it, and he said, if you're going to throw the second gate overboard, then you should throw me overboard with it as well. And at that very moment, the sea and the storm calmed down, and obviously they didn't throw it overboard, and they sailed the rest of the way from Alexandria to Eretz Yisrael, to Israel. And when they came, Nicanor was obviously very upset because he was supposed to come with two doors, but instead he only came with one door. But as they arrived in the port of Akko, they looked behind him, and right behind the boat was this gate, this huge gate made out of bronze that kind of just broke straight through the water and landed on shore right next to them. Obviously a tremendous miracle how the gate followed them through the water and came to Israel as well. So that was the gates of Nicanor that Nicanor put up, that had this tremendous miracle that survived the sea as well. Interesting that the Talmud over there discusses why it was made out of bronze. And it says that it was special bronze which was shining like gold. So even though it was bronze, it was very shiny, it shone like gold. So there you have it. That is the Sha'ar Nicanor, the gates of Nicanor. Here's another look at the gates of Nicanor. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the temple courtyard and the chambers that were surrounding it. So this section over here is what we just dealt with these four sections and that surround, those are the stairs. That's called the Ezras Nashim. This next section over here is called the Azora, the actual courtyard. And this square over here that I'm going over with my mouse, that was the actual building of the Beit Hamikdash. That was the actual building. That was an indoor structure. But what we're looking at right now is still kind of part of the courtyard. So we're going to take a look at these different chambers that were surrounding. So they were in the next section, in the courtyard section, but they were surrounding all around, and we're going to see what they were used for. All right. So here's again a little bit of a different angle. So we've discussed this whole area where you have these four chambers, and here's the steps, and we've gone through. And now we're kind of going into the next section. We're going to talk about the different chambers that were surrounding the different areas over here. So at the top, next to Sha'ar Nicanor, these gates of Nicanor, there was these two chambers, one on each side, and this was called the chamber of Pinchas, the clothier. What do you think was kept inside there? So as it sounds, this was where the Kohanim's clothing were kept. The Kohen had to dress a very specific way. There was 4 pieces of clothing that a Kohen would have to wear when he came to work in the Beit Hamikdash, and couldn't exactly take them home. So they had a special chamber where they would keep all the clothes and mend all the clothing, and they would fit the Kohanim and take care of them as well. It was named after this man called Pinchas because Pinchas at some point was a famous person who tended to the needs of the Kohanim in terms of their clothing. Obviously, he didn't live through the first and the second temple, but it kind of picked up his name as a result of the service that he had done on behalf of the Kohanim. So on the south side, next to the gate of Nicanor, we have another chamber, and this chamber was called the chamber of Minchas Chavitin. And what that is that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, was obligated to offer 12 meal offerings every single day on the altar. So a meal offering was flour and oil. It wasn't an animal. And every single day, the Kohen Gadol was bringing 12 of those. So that was being prepared for him specifically right over here in this chamber. So again, we have this chamber over here next to the gates of Nicanor on the north. That was for the clothing. And next to the gates of Nicanor on the south, this is where they were preparing for the high priest his 12 meal offerings, which was made up of flour and oil and whatever else was inside of there in this particular chamber. So over here, we have the southeast corner chambers. So this is the south and this is the east. So we have over here 3 pretty small chambers, and here you have a very different angle of what we're looking at. So this over here is the actual, this tells you kind of the angle that you're looking at it from. So you're seeing over the altar and into the southeast corner where there are these 3 chambers. So what's inside these 3 chambers? We have, one of them was called the Lishkas Hamelach, the chamber of salt. That is where they stored the salt. A lot of salt used in the temple. All sacrifices, all animal and bird sacrifices were salted. Those meal offerings that we spoke about a few minutes ago was used with salt. They would actually pour salt onto the ramp of the altar to avoid slipping, kind of like what we do when it snows, but also you have to remember that there was sometimes blood and liquid on the floor. All right, so that was one of them. So that was for the salt. The middle one out of these 3 was called Lishkas HaParva, and that is where the hides of the animal were processed. So they were bringing numerous sacrifices every single day and had a lot of animal skins to deal with. And they would deal with all of the hides in there. And then lastly, you had the third one, which was called Lishkas Hamadichin. And over there, they would bring the inner organs of the different burnt offerings and they would wash them out before being brought onto the altar. So after they slaughter the animal and they take out certain parts of the insides that have to be rinsed out before they can be brought on the altar, they would bring them here to this chamber and they would prepare them, and then they would bring them back to the altar. Now, interestingly is that in these 3 chambers, there was, they were kind of like a double story, and on the top story of the middle chamber, there was a mikveh. So there was a spiral staircase that would go up from that chamber where they would prepare the hides. There was it was on top, kind of on top of, you entered through one and it was on top of the other. But if you can imagine, like on top of these three chambers over here that you're looking at highlighted, there was a staircase that would go up and there was a mikveh. And we know that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest on Yom Kippur, would go to the mikveh 4 times during his services, every time he changed back and forth between the clothing. And this is the mikveh that he was using during that time. Here you see what I'm talking about. There's this kind of spiral staircase that would go up, and at the top there is a mikveh. It seems like there's 2 kohanim holding up a sheet, obviously to give him some sort of a privacy. So there you have it. That is the mikveh that you're looking at the top as a second story on top of these 3 chambers. All right, now we go all the way completely to the other side. So now we are on the northern side, and we're looking at these sets of chambers. So again, we're on the northeast corner of the chambers because this side is the east. And let's take a look at these northeastern chambers as well. So you can see, by the way, this is the altar right over here. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in these spaces over here, who would stand here, and what these are some stairs. But before we do that, we're just kind of covering all of these different chambers that go all around. So we also have 3 chambers over here, structured slightly differently, but you can see them in yellow. You have 1, 2, and 3. And you have one of these chambers, which was the Supreme Court chambers. So I mentioned to you before that there was another Sanhedrin, which was the lower court. They were in the Ezras Nashim and the other courtyard, but here's even a higher court. They would be over here in this one. You see it kind of in a semicircle. That's how they would sit. There you go. So this is a special chamber for the courts to sit, the highest court to sit and to meet, to discuss whatever they would have to. Any questions that anyone wants to ask?
Yes, I do have a silly question.
No, sir.
This checkers-like floor, was it done on purpose or?
I'm not sure.
What?
I think so. I think it's like for design, the kind of marble floor.
Yeah, what's the reason behind it? Why is it that type of design?
It's a good question. Sorry.
I was just saying, I was wondering that too.
So first of all, it's not a silly question. Let's finish kind of getting all the perimeter, and then we'll come back to the actual floor of the temple, because you'll see it comes up a couple times. It was a marble stone floor, and the Kohanim had to walk around barefoot. So we'll talk about the floor. We'll get to the floor. So yes, good question. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. All right, so we have this section over here, which is for the Sanhedrin. And then you have over here, Chamber 1, the Supreme Court overhead view. Here you have perhaps what it would look like inside the court, where there's the leaders of the court and the other judges, and 2 people presenting. I guess that's somebody's imagination as to what they think the court would look like. Here we have the priests, the Kohanim, praying inside that section as well. Here we have the second chamber, and we're looking at it from the overhead view as well. So this was called Lishkas Ha'etz, which means the chamber of wood, because it was built out of wood. And this is where the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would stay during his week-long preparation for Yom Kippur when he could not leave the temple. So for one whole week before Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would move into the Beit Hamikdash, and he would be prepped and study Torah and do all of those different things. So that kind of became his private chambers during that week before. And here you can see that there's people meeting with him and studying with him. This over here would be the high priest. This one sitting over here in the blue, and but there's people teaching him, and so he would move in for a whole week before Yom Kippur to he wasn't allowed to leave the temple before Yom Kippur for an entire week, and he would go through everything, etc. So we have over here, this is kind of L-shaped, was for the high court. This is where the Kohen Gadol would stay for a week before Yom Kippur. And lastly, the small section that we have over here was called the Chamber of the Well, Lishkat Hagala. And underneath this chamber, there was a well. And this is where they would go and draw water from for whatever water they needed to be used on the temple. So that's pretty cool. There was a well that was underneath here, and they can draw water for any water that was needed in the temple from right over here. All right, so we covered these three over here, which was, the salt and the hides and washing out the innards. Then we came to this side, and we have the high court, and we had room for the Kohen Gadol, and we had the room for the well. So now we move on a little bit further down over here. This is the northern side, and we come to this courtyard over here, and let's take a look at what we are looking at. So this is just giving you a little bit of a different angle. You're looking at the northern wall right over here. So we just finished talking about these chambers right over here. This is what we just finished speaking about. So you would be looking, and if you look at the bottom right corner, that's kind of the angle that you're looking at the temple. So you'd be looking at the northern wall right over here. So we're going to be discussing these different chambers that kind of went down along the northern wall. There's a little bit of a different view to what we would be looking at. So we discussed one already. That's the one that we spoke about. That was for the high court, for the Sanhedrin, etc., etc. So let's see what else was along the wall. All right. So the second chamber along the northern wall is called the Beit Hamikdash or Shar Hamikdash, and inside there's going to be. Yeah, come take this. You know where to plug it in? Inside here, we're going to have a bunch of different kind of areas for different things. There's this dome on the top, as you can see, and we'll take a look at some of the more specific things that are happening inside. So first of all, inside here, this Beit Hamikdash is where the Kohanim that were on duty would sleep. So it was sleeping quarters. So if you're, it's your week or your 2 weeks in the Beit Hamikdash in the temple, they would, this is where you camped out. This is where you would sleep. Not sure how fancy their sleeping quarters were, but this is where it was. Some interesting things about this chamber. So, out of respect, they would lock up the temple every single night, and the keys were kept under a slab of marble, and the leader of that particular shift would sleep on top of that marble. So here you can see in the picture over here, you see the Kohen is lifting up that like slab, and there's that big golden key. That's the key to the temple, in which they would have a ceremony when they would open it up every morning, and somebody would sleep on top of that every single night. This was also a chamber that was very close to the altar where the Kohanim would bring the sacrifices, which is what the Kohanim were busy with most of the time. So if you were a Kohen working in the temple, most probably you were being assigned to sacrifices, especially around holiday times. So there was some fires burning in here, as you can see. And that way, if the Kohanim were cold, they can come and walk and warm up and then get straight back to business and wouldn't have to take too long. We mentioned this earlier, but the Torah says that the Kohanim have to walk around barefoot. And in addition to walking around barefoot, their clothing wasn't exactly thick down pieces of clothing. They were wearing very thin pieces of linen, or very, very thin clothing. So in the summer, maybe not such a big deal, but in a chilly, cold Jerusalem winter, I'm sure there was a lot of Kohanim coming up in here to get warmed up. So this is kind of the general room, but inside this whole section, there were another 4 chambers as well. So here you can see, we were looking at kind of in the middle over here where there was sleeping quarters. And now we're going to take a look at a bunch of other rooms that were part of this Beit Hamikdash. So let me see something 1 second. All right. So we have, first of all, the Chamber of Approved Offerings. The Chamber of Approved Offerings is where they would bring the animals to be checked before the animals can be brought onto the altar. So you obviously know that an animal cannot be brought onto the altar if it had any blemishes. So they would bring the animals that they wanted to bring as a sacrifice into here, and the Kohanim would check them and make sure that they were perfect before they could be brought onto the altar. That's the Chamber of Approved Offerings. Then you had another chamber, of where the Lechem Hapanim was being made. So here you have the chamber of the show bread makers. So one of the things that was happening in the temple is that there was a table inside the actual building of the Beit Hamikdash called the Shulchan, the table, and there was lechem hapanim, special bread on it, and the bread was taken off once a week and replaced. Miracle that it stayed fresh for an entire week, and it was eaten by the Kohanim. So that is what they would be doing in this corner. As you can see over here, there's a special craft to making this lechem hapanim. Wasn't such a simple thing. Then in the all right, then in the northwest corner, we have the Chamber of Seals. and the descent to the mikveh. Just trying to figure out exactly what he wants to say over here. So over here, I think you can see that there's a descent that would go, or even here, there's a mikveh right over here. So here it is. You see there's a staircase right over here. So this is kind of down underneath. Probably the staircase right over here. The staircase would take you down and you would get to a mikveh. So on top of this, there was a room where there was a fire burning the entire time. Also could be used for warming, or for whatever else they would need for fire. And then the Kohanim, who had been sleeping upstairs, can go use the mikveh before they began their morning shift. So that's some of the chambers along the northern side. And lastly, this one over here, number 3, was called Lishkas Beit Hamikdash, and there was a fire constantly burning there as well. And that served as a source of fire in case the altar fire went out. So it doesn't seem like there was too much going on in here, other than the fact that there was a fire constantly burning. And if they ever needed it, they would use it. So this one is pretty busy. This is where they were checking animals, and sleeping, and using the mikveh, and preparing the lechem hapanim, the bread, and doing all of those kinds of things. This one seemed to have been a little bit more quiet. Anyone have any questions? So just very quickly, on this side, we have a chamber which was called Lishkas Beit Avtinas, and that is where they would prepare the incense to be brought daily on the incense altar, kind of like a secret, exactly how to make it. No one really knew how to make it except for a special family. On the southern wall, you also had another mikveh. So here you have, this is where they would make the incense. This looks like sleeping quarters for the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, where he could sleep. Here we have also along the southern side, we have another mikveh. And that seems to be it. All right, I think we're going to stop over here. Hope you learned a couple interesting